Hey y'all, good afternoon or morning, I guess 11's morning. All right, we'll give one more minute and then go ahead and get started. Okay, it looks like we're good. So I'll go ahead and get started. I know obviously this is facilitated by the Career Center, so it's going to be recorded and available to you all later. Before I get started, I always just like to say I'm super conversational when it comes to workshops. So if you all have a question, feel free to throw a question in the chat. I'll try to check the little notifications from time to time, or just go off mute and ask your question anytime throughout the presentation. Happy to help however I can. But just to start off with, wanted to introduce myself. So my name is Bri Berry. I currently serve as a supervisor of talent acquisition and university engagement for TD SYNNEX. I will talk a little bit about who TD SYNNEX is, just so you all have kind of a baseline understanding. But the heart of today's workshop is really to talk about interviewing and interviewing stories, and how to prep. What does it look like to interview well? What can you do on the front end, during, after? So we'll kind of do a conclusive picture of it all. So who is TD SYNNEX? And just to give you guys kind of a background, especially for anybody who may be interested, TD SYNNEX is a massive Fortune 100 company. So across the globe, we have 22,000 employees. Majority of those employees are based in the US. But basically, the way that we would describe who we are is on really saying we're an IT distribution company that focuses in logistics and integration. So what does that mean? We sell all the technology products in the world that you can think of. So we are B2B. All of our customers are businesses, and we are selling businesses resources. And so when you look at the supply chain, we really are the middleman between the big tech companies that you all know, the Googles, the Apples, the Lenovo's of the world. We help to bring their products to market, is how we say it. So if you have any interest in being in the tech industry and you're highly relational and you love people, and you really want to this is honestly, distribution is a really lucrative field. TD SYNNEX is a really great place to work. So in terms of our history, we were founded in the late 70s, early 80s. In September of 2021, last year, we merged SYNNEX Corporation and Tech Data into TD SYNNEX. So just for context in terms of where did that name come from, and just our history. So now, again, we have been a global company, but now we're even more global than we were before. Our biggest locations in the US are Clearwater, Florida, and Greenville, South Carolina. We have another headquarter location in Fremont, California, outside of the Bay Area. And then we also have office locations in Colorado, Texas, Ohio, and Arizona. And then we have a whole host of remote employees. So there's kind of a place for everybody, if you will. So as we get started, I kind of just want to talk through what sort of programs we have. So we have your standard summer internship program that's 11 to 12 weeks. Outside of that, we have a few programs for other students. So our micro internship program is designed currently for Clemson football players. And our hope is to expand that to other athletes who have just seasons that are constraining them. Then we also have a tech scholar program that I'll mention, and that one is focused specifically for computer science, cybersecurity, and then some computer information systems, depending on how technical you are. And the goal for that is that we want to find students who have an interest in cybersecurity, data, networking, and unified communications. And then those bottom two, college graduates. So we do have a program for recent college grads called the Discovery Rep program, which really, if you boil it down, it's a sales rotational program. So it allows you the ability to kind of work through different rotations in our company so you can figure out where you want to land permanently without having to know that day one. And then outside of that, we obviously also have a whole host of entry-level roles that we could consider folks for. So as I share today, I just want to give perspective of kind of the programs that we hire for so you all know what exactly is a part of this. So today we'll kind of talk through, right, how do you successfully use your resume and experience to really make yourself stand out as a candidate in the process. Another part is understanding professionalism in interviews, right? What is protocol, what's standard, what's helpful, what will make you stand out. And the last piece, kind of proper communication. So obviously interviewing has changed a lot in the past 2 years just because of COVID and the virtual component. And so that's something that I wanted to make sure I shared about today. So to start off with, and these are really just questions for you all to process as you listen, I want you to just think about your past interview experiences. What were strengths that you feel like you had? What were some weaknesses? If you didn't get a job or a position or an internship, did you get any feedback, right? One thing that I've heard a lot from students and just candidates in general is that it's really hard to receive feedback to know where to get better. And then the last thing, what strange or hard questions have you been asked? So I'll give a minute just for anybody to kind of sit and think about that. If you would like to share your answer in the chat, that'd be awesome. Thanks, Ava. Okay, so hard question, being asked about experience, like describe a time when. Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of those in interviews. One time I was asked, it was like a would you rather, like be attacked. I think it was like 5,000 ducks or a horse. And I was so thrown off because I was like, I don't even know what this has to do with the job, but it caught me off guard enough to help them see, I guess, who I was if I'm caught off guard. So yeah, just, you know, as we kind of go through this presentation, I wanted to start off with a reflection so you all can start thinking about like what are areas that you feel like you actually need maybe advice or recommendation on when it comes to interviews. And I always say, right, no matter how your interview goes, if you get the job or if you don't get the job or the position or whatever, it's always important to reflect on interviews right away so you can continue to build and develop your interview skills in the future. So I'm going to give a lot of information today. I will say I will share this slide deck. So if you all are writing notes or taking notes, please know that this will be sent out to you. So I don't want you to feel like you have to get it all at one moment. So I wanted to just share kind of a brief summary of my story so I could explain a little bit of the context that I'm coming in with besides being a recruiter. So for me personally in undergrad, I did a ton of internships, and I didn't say this at the beginning, but I actually went to Clemson for undergrad and grad school. So during undergrad, I was in the College of Business and I did a ton of the UPIC internships through the Career Center. They were all amazing, but what I realized when I got to the end of undergrad is that I really didn't do a great job at tracking any of my experiences. So, you know, if someone asked me kind of what I learned or what skills I had, that's great, but it also made me kind of realize, oh yeah, I don't really know exactly what I learned from specific positions. I wasn't able to truly like articulate professional competencies and development And so when I got out of undergrad, I at least had the honor of getting to work in the Academic Success Center. And I had talked to the director and just said, hey, I know I want to go to grad school in about 6 months, but I have a gap of time. Can I stay on board and work? And they allowed that, and it was great. But what I started to realize in that time is that, if I'm going to be looking for full-time opportunities in 2 years once I finish grad school, I need to start working on who I am and what skills I bring to the table. So kind of insert year one of grad school, and I decided to completely pivot. I became a person who had all these Excel documents of experiences and skills and what I was growing and developing. And I share that to say in grad school, we had to do 3 additional experiences outside of a graduate assistantship. And your assistantship is kind of your full-time job, and the other ones were just shorter stints. But what I realized is I was doing so many different jobs at one time in grad school that it was really helpful for me to keep track of everything, because I could really kind of hone in and flip my resume around to be a value add during interviews. And so that kind of lands me to this third point, job opportunities. After my first year of grad school, I actually got connected to, or I got reached out by a recruiter from my current company, TD SYNNEX. And she said, I met you one time at a career fair. I was helping her carry her boxes. And she's like, I've kind of kept up with you on LinkedIn. And she was like, would you be interested in a university engagement recruiter role? So I share all of this to say that, obviously looking at kind of the series of being able to keep documentation over what I was learning helped me prep to not only make my LinkedIn stronger and better in my resume, but it really helped lend itself to me getting my foot in the door at a company that I wouldn't have if I didn't do those things. So every time that I did another experience, I was updating LinkedIn. Every time I did another experience, I was updating my resume and continuing to put myself out there. And so that's kind of how she was able to circle back and to know that some of the experiences I was having in grad school were going to prepare me really well for this role. So before we kind of begin, I just want to show a quick picture of the recruitment process. And I want to talk today about kind of what touch points matter in terms of doing well in interviews. So when we look at kind of the total recruitment process, there's really 7 major steps. And the ones that I want to highlight today, step 2, so creating and updating your documents. It's really important that you have a strong resume, not only for having something nice to look at, but because your resume really dictates where conversation can go in interviews. Typically speaking, a manager or a recruiter is going to be sitting in front of your sitting in front of your resume in an interview, and they're going to be asking you questions on your experience. And obviously the conversation can become personal if they, see things that resonate with them, but your resume is really what is going to kind of determine and lead that conversation. And, once you're in the process of prepping for interviews, we're going to touch on that today. Like, what can you do beforehand to do well? And then what can you do during and after to ensure that you are really standing out as a candidate in the process? So there's kind of 4 major pieces that really will hone in on how successful you are in the process. And I always like to add a caveat. If you are applying to a ton of jobs and you're not getting any calls back, edit your resume. If your resume isn't at least getting you some level of interviews, know that that's the best place to start to update and to change and to make sure it's more easily able to read and articulate your experiences. So kind of starting on that first step, creating and updating your documents. What is important to include in your resume? Again, I will send all this out, and I'm not going to go through every bullet point, but I do want to say that when you think about what's important to talk about in an interview from past experiences, these are questions that you can process all of your experiences through that will help you figure out how you want to share about those. So if you did an internship, if you did a part-time job, if you were in a research class or club, if you were president of an organization, right? Start to think about what were things that you were responsible over. The more responsibility that you can demonstrate that you gained from past jobs, the stronger you will stand out as a candidate. The second thing, make sure you take note of the people that you meet. Right now you can look online, but the average percentage of folks who get jobs from networking is between 80 to 85% of jobs are found that way. So your networks matter. And a lot of people may feel nervous about networking or don't even know where to start to begin to build a network. If you are doing experiences, whether that be an organization on campus or internships or whatever, make sure you're taking note of people and just getting their contact information and kind of, what their position or title is. So that way you can build that relationship out and follow up with them. And then the last thing, what sort of experiences did you have? And that kind of goes hand in hand with the part that says process your experience. So I have always said, internships and jobs are helpful, especially in college, to help you figure out what you do want to do, but they are extremely helpful in helping you figure out what you don't want to do. So the reason why I say process your experience, on the one hand, you want to make sure that you're able to articulate what achievements you had, what areas can you grow in? And I'll share a little bit later of what this looks like for me, but you will show up as a really strong candidate if you can come to an interview and be honest and confident in what skills you are currently developing that you wouldn't say you have 100% figured out. So for me personally, timeliness. I am perpetually late all the time, and I know that about myself. Now, does that mean that I'm worse at the job? No, because I'm always going to stay after work to finish things if I come in late. However, if there's someone who needs a very punctual person, I'm not going to be the girl. So that's an example. That's something that I'm actively growing on. I'm trying to figure out in my life how I can be better at time management. Again, it's not going to necessarily make me a bad candidate, but me coming into an interview to say, hey, this is something that I'm actively working on. I know it's a struggle for me and then I'll have to be held accountable for that, but I want to grow in that. And I know that it's currently a weakness. Another thing, and this is where people really kind of slip on their resumes, quantifying information. It is really important that you showcase if you're working with a specific budget, how large that budget was, what size of teams are you working on? Tell me if you're helping to collaborate with an 8-person team or a 50-person team, right? That's going to help me understand as a recruiter and as a manager, your ability to navigate difficulty in work and navigate conversations and conflict and relationships in general. So you want to make sure you're adding quantifying information. How many hours did you work on a project? How consistently were you working or doing something? So the more that you can spell out, the better. And then the last little piece, interactions with people, right? Figuring out kind of what was the culture in the company, what's the style of leadership you were under. Those are all parts of processing your experience to figure out, number one, would you want to come back to the company? But number two, what do you need out of a work environment to truly thrive? So I know this is super blurry, but I just kind of want to give context as to what everything that I took notes on and kept a record of in grad school was really this document. So this is a screenshot of my Excel sheet, but basically what I would do is anytime I did an event, so whether I was helping to plan something, whether I was trying to go to an event or if I helped manage anything, I would put the title of the event, the dates that I was working on it, and then in the notes section, I would type anywhere from who was I working with across campus to what were the roles and responsibilities. So for example, I got to sit on the diversity committee for the College of Ed. So what that looked like is in the fall, we met 4 times. I knew I was working directly with my advisor and program coordinator for our program. And then I also was getting to sit with the dean at certain times. Another one at the bottom, I helped plan an upstate networking event with different career services. So again, this document was a way to just put really messy notes so I wouldn't forget. I knew I needed to remember that there was going to be 21 schools at this place, that there was going to be 90 people that I had helped to plan an event for, that we had a budget of $2,500, right? Those are all going to be super important pieces of information that will help drive your conversation further in interviews. Here are kind of the 2 pieces that I touched on. So, for you to create in Excel or whatever you want to keep it in a notes page, what exactly, what task you've done. Again, that can be turned into a bullet point on your resume, which could then start a conversation in an interview. That's all your goal of your resume is to help drive you to get interviews and to have conversations. This piece at the bottom, again, is the tab that I kept that helps me figure out what sort of things do I need to improve in terms of skills and professional development. So, when someone asks in an interview, what would you say your weakness or area of improvement is? immediately I remembered this chart and I could easily call back skills or things that I knew that I needed to develop. And the quicker that you can answer with confidence, the better in an interview, because it really shows that you have thought about this and that you are certain what you can bring to the table and what you can't. So, in summary, kind of thinking about your professional documents, I just want to reiterate, your resume should really reflect that you are the most qualified and have relevant experience of candidates. And if you feel like your resume isn't doing that for a field that you're trying to pursue, then that's a good first place to start, So that kind of concludes the section on professional documents, but does anyone have any questions? I haven't seen any in the chat, so I'll keep going if no one stops me. Awesome. So this last little piece, and I kind of wanted to show this just so you guys could see what does it look like to prep well for kind of an interview, and then also just making sure that your professional resume is actually aligned to jobs that you're applying to. So this is a little exercise that you could do at any time, but if you need like action verbs or things to maybe keywords to look for or to talk about in an interview, this is a really good place to start. So when you think about your dream job or internship, what comes to mind? And then I would encourage you to go to Google and to look up that job description. The reason being, obviously, you want to figure out what sort of responsibilities they want to see out of a candidate in that job. But the second thing is you want to figure out what sort of keywords keep coming up. Those are the things that are going to be really important for you to talk about in an interview and really important for you to mention on your resume. So once you find the job description, and I wanted to give an example from my own personal life. So a job title that I'd looked at, a recruiting coordinator for internships. I really wanted to manage the recruitment efforts for an intern program for some company. And so, when I put it in the worded out webpage, a lot of words came up, but the ones that frequented were the ones that I have to the right. So talent, hiring, coordinate, recruit. When we talk about resumes and getting to start all of your bullet points with an action verb, this is a really helpful activity to do. And then on top of it, what I can figure out from this worded kind of cloud is, hey, when I'm in the interview, I need to talk about how I have created strategy before. I need to talk about how I have managed a series of candidates or documents. I need to figure out how I've created processes before, because those are all things that are going to be a part of the job, but I need to figure out how I can articulate it. And honestly, back to Ava's question about when you have to answer questions that say, describe a time when, these are going to be helpful buzzwords that will drive you figuring out kind of what sort of questions you could be asked that require more in-depth answers. Okay, so next we'll just talk through interviews and prepping and what can happen during. But what I want to say before we really get there is that, there's a lot of pressure for a lot of people during interviews. I personally love interviewing. I think that it's really a formal conversation. And so I love talking to people, but I completely understand people that feel nervous and anxious about it. And one thing I just want to add is that, yes, you are being interviewed for, some sort of role when you're in that process and they are trying to figure out if you truly are the best candidate. But if you reverse that, you are also interviewing a company, and it's just as important for you to truly decide if you want to work for that organization. So when you're stepping into an interview process, there's always 3 questions that I think are helpful to think through. Are you the best candidate? And typically, if you're going into an interview, you should be believing that you are. Do I have a passion for this, right? Some of this you will have to figure out in real timing during your interview. The more questions that you can ask and the more information you can get, the better you'll be able to make that decision. And then the last question, is this organization a good fit for me? And what I mean about that is that, you're going to be spending more time in an internship or in work than you would be anything else during a week, because it's at least 40 hours typically. So you want to make sure that you're working for an organization that has values or a work environment that's conducive to the things that you need. So that third thing is that in your interview, you're really trying to figure out, does this organization value the things that I do, and is it going to be a good fit for me overall? So when we talk about prep for an interview, one of the first places that I encourage people to start is an informational interview. Since I left grad school, I went part-time and took this job on full-time, and I graduated last May, but I have had a lot of people from my program reach out and just say, hey, I think I want to pivot from working in student affairs to working in university engagement. Can I just have 15 to 20 minutes of your time to hear about what that looks like? And those conversations are amazing. And I will tell you that people love to talk about what they do. And so an informational interview is the perfect way to get a ton of data and research on specific roles or companies or industries, while also respecting people's time and building your network. It's really kind of a double benefiting experience, because not only are you getting information to help you better prepare for interviews, but you're also getting to build your network. And I always encourage people, when you finish an informational interview for whoever you're going to meet with, maybe they're in an industry you want to be in, or maybe they have a role that you want, always end by saying, hey, is there 1 to 2 other people that you would encourage me to reach out to in the process? So I say this is a good prep, because if you are, for example, for me, if I were to meet with a talent acquisition partner and I ask them questions about their job, everything that they share, I can then use that data to figure out, okay, how can I best prepare for this interview if I get it? Or how can I make sure I'm sharing experiences and responses that will truly align and help me stand out as the best candidate? So once you move from kind of your prep stage to actually doing interviews, there's going to be kind of a series of interview types that you could do. And I'll walk through just kind of overall general advice for interviews, but I wanted to make sure I called out just the different types of interviews you can do. Great question. How can I prepare myself not to get nervous in order to answer greatly when I'm asked an unexpected question? And I will talk about that on the next slide. So types of interviews. First and foremost, digital interviews. I'm actually going to show you guys a screenshot of what we use at my company in a later slide. The second one is phone screens / interviews. And I say / interviews because there's 2 different things that can happen in a recruitment process. A recruiter could reach out to you first to do what we would call at my company a screening call, which is just a chance to get to know you, to verify that you would be an eligible employee for our company. And that is not really an interview. It's more intaking information, and then from there, a recruiter can decide if they want to share your information and you as a candidate to another manager. So we would say your first step in our process is to do a digital interview or a phone screen, and then the next step would be your first interview with a manager. So another thing to add there is that your first interview could be video or in person, right? For the past 2.5 years, we've seen all of our candidates come through a virtual experience. But how you show up on video is going to be very, very different than in person, and how you prep for a video interview is going to be different than in person. Another example of an interview type is case study interviews. So when I worked at the Career Center at Clemson, one of the things that some of our employers would do when they came in was have students complete a case study in 30 minutes. And again, you want to make sure that you're able to practice and prep for those, but typically speaking, if it's a job that you're going to be doing maybe like very high level and technical things for, a case study or some sort of assessment is going to be a part of your interview process. So for example, for us, we have some roles that require Python and C++ and a lot of technical software programs and knowledge of those. And so for us, we have folks go through a skills assessment on the front end, because if you don't rank at a certain percentage, we're not going to consider you, because we know that the job would be harder if you're not able to do that. And the last thing I would say is that case studies really demonstrate how well you know the information that's required for the job. So for example, for both of those tests that I mentioned, we actually are able to see on the back end how long it took you to answer questions, and then were you pending a long time? So companies can tell if you're like looking up stuff on Google, and for some jobs that's appropriate, but for other jobs you may need to know that information a little bit more readily. And the last one, second / on-site interview. So again, typically most companies have a 2 to 3 step interview process. So that kind of second one, or your final interview, should really be either with another manager, or maybe with teams, or with a VP or something within the role. So someone who's a little more higher level, or you getting to meet more of the team as a way for them to kind of make a group decided effort on if you're the best candidate. And you definitely don't have to go through all of these. These are just possible types. So before you interview, we talked about kind of the prep work of doing informational interviews, looking at job descriptions, getting your resume up to date. But when we talk about preparing well for a specific interview for a specific role, the first thing I would say is research, right? You want to make sure you know the ins and the outs of that role, but you also want to make sure that you have information around kind of what the company is up to. And then from there, you want to make sure that you really know yourself. So one thing that I do, if you have a portfolio or a folder, I always bring a sheet of paper that has my top 10 experiences, so things that I know really hone in on the skills that I have. And then I put a list of my top 5 to 10 best attributes or characteristics. And I know this sounds really silly, but I'll call my friends and I'll ask them, hey, what do you think I'm really good at? I'll call folks that I worked with before, maybe that I interned with. Hey, can you tell me what things you felt like I did really good? One thing I have done recently is I took the Strengths Finder. That gave me my top 5 easy. So just getting to know yourself. And then I also create a list of weaknesses, a super short list, maybe 3 to 5, just to make sure if I'm asked that question, I already have it. And one thing, and I want to go back to the question in the chat because it's a great question. How do you prepare to not be nervous in an interview? I will say the reason why I bring that sheet of paper in my portfolio or in my folder is that when I'm feeling really anxious or nervous in an interview, as long as I have all those things written down, I'm able to look down and to see a few buzzwords that I've written to help me kind of ground myself and recall what I wanted to say. And it's helpful for me throughout the interview just to be able to continue to reference back to that list of experiences to say, okay, I did tell them that I know how to manage a budget, but I haven't told them that I was able to lead a team of 10 before. Like in my mind, I'm making note, I need to make sure I explain my leadership qualities. So again, the more that you can prepare and the notes that you can kind of put together to help ground yourself, if you're feeling anxious in an interview, the better. And you can have that sheet right in front of you in an interview if you're in person. And then if you're virtual, then you can just do a side-by-side screen, right? Have your Zoom or Teams call on one side, and then your Microsoft document or Google Docs on the other with just some notes. Making sure you know the logistics. And I will say this for digital interviews, it's really, really important that you test out your mic, your camera, your background, everything beforehand, because that will really make you kind of fumble your interview if you haven't prepared. For resumes, make sure you bring the most updated copy. I always love when a candidate shows up in person and they have a resume on hand. It just shows to me that they chose to prepare and be thoughtful beforehand. And the last 2 things, obviously practice, and I'll go into depth about what that can look like later. But preparing a list of questions to ask the employer. There are tons of great resources online that has a series of questions you can ask employers. The only thing that I will add there is just to be careful what questions you're asking in what interview. So in your first interview, it's not typically appropriate to ask about salary expectations because you're not really far enough along in the process. However, it is really appropriate to ask about like work culture and dynamic and team environment and things like that. On the right, I just gave you guys just a few bullet points of what would be helpful to research. Again, the more information that you can have about the company, the better, not only for you showing up as a candidate who did the research and people can tell, but so you know what you're getting into as you interview. Okay, so during, a few different things to say here. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're dressing professionally, and just making sure you understand the vibe. I mean, I will give an example at the career fair, right? Abercrombie and Fitch is always an employer that's there. If you guys have been to the Clemson Career Fair, the way that their reps dress is going to be dramatically different than me who works in a corporate tech space, right? And so again, if it makes sense to wear something that's a little more trendy and hip because that is the, overall kind of environment at Abercrombie and Fitch per se, then make that your outfit. But if you're going to go in a corporate setting or something like that, make sure you're dressing specific to their sort of professional business code, if you will. The next thing I would say is just impressions. And, I talked to you guys earlier about my time management thing, arriving 15 minutes early. That's really hard for me, but on days that I've had interviews, you always want to make sure you put your best foot forward. So give yourself more time than not. Bringing a notebook or a portfolio or a folder that has some paper for you to write in, just to make sure that you're able to have a place to kind of recall information that was shared in the interview. The last two, making sure that you handshake if you're in person. If not, it doesn't matter. And if you don't feel comfortable handshaking and do know that that can be a really big possibility for some people, figure out another way that you're able to, show some sort of kind gesture. So even if it's just a head nod or a thank you, you definitely don't have to handshake. And then the last thing is greeting by name. One thing that I do think is really important is if you get some sort of calendar invite or email that gives you details about your interview coming up, make sure you practice and recite the names of the people that you'll be meeting with and get information around that. It's really important. The last two are really just kind of focus bullet points. So making sure you're not chewing gum or wearing any sort of fragrance or smells that are going to be too much for the in-person environment. And then, of course, maintaining eye contact. I honestly believe that eye contact is a lot easier over virtual interviews, but in person, I always tell people, if you feel nervous about making eye contact, look in the center of someone's forehead, because they'll never be able to know if you're looking at their forehead or if you're looking at their eyes, because it's the same direction. And in terms of like a percentage, like you want to make sure you're making eye contact at least like 60 to 70% of the time. So do know that you can look away. You don't have to be glued the whole time, but you want to make sure that you're not looking down a ton. Like you want to make sure that you're moving your head, that your body language seems responsive. And one thing I will say, if you get nervous in interviews, figure out what ways to work around whatever sort of nervous habits you have. So for example, I use my hands a lot when I talk, and sometimes that gets really distracting in interviews. So I'll sit on one of my hands and I'll just use one to talk, because that way it's not like this grand show of both hands. For some of my friends who maybe like tap their fingers a lot on the table, I always say, just keep your hands closed in like if you were like holding hands, but with your two hands in your lap. Just something that will help you, allow you to move your fingers if you need to without having to make that noise. If you look around a lot, making sure that you're at least looking up, again, the forehead thing, whatever feels like it would be helpful to kind of reduce it. And I will tell you guys, what to do in your practice interviewing to figure out what your sort of nervous habits are. The ones to the right, obviously we talked about showing confidence and expressing yourself and trusting yourself. And I'll kind of go through how to prepare examples, but it is really important that you look up practice interview questions. So what I'll say for these are different interview question types. Figure out what is common in your industry and field. So I will tell you all, for us, like opinion and situational, and then skills-based and behavioral are going to be the three top questions that we would have in an interview, because our job is sales and it's really people focused. And so we need to know what you're going to be like on the job. We don't really look for credential-based, we don't prepare credential-based questions because it's not really going to matter in our sales positions versus in our like database positions. There's going to be more of those. So it's important for you to really know kind of what the interview is going to entail. And then just making sure that you prepare a wide variety of responses for different interview question types. I always say the more practice that you can do, the better you'll be on the other side. Even if you're not even answered all these questions, just getting in a rhythm of answering interview questions and knowing how to do that will help you stand out as stronger. But these are just a series of different types. So back to Ava's question around experience-based questions, describe a time when. This chart, and you guys may have already heard of this in your classes or with maybe folks in the Career Center, the STAR method. I know that it may be redundant if you've heard about this before, but I cannot tell you how important it is to learn how to answer interview questions in this method. It's going to feel super clunky and super robotic in the beginning, but I will tell you, the more that you can answer past experiences in this way, the stronger you will stand out as a candidate in the process. So for example, if you did an internship or if you volunteered or if you have been in an organization, for every like series of bullet points you have on your resume, figure out how to share about that experience in the STAR method. So if you're going to put that you volunteered with Habitat for Humanity on your resume, let's figure out an example that you could use in an interview. So maybe you rallied a group of volunteers together. So for Set the Scene, you would talk about like, yeah, over the course of 2 months, I helped manage the volunteer schedule for Habitat for Humanity. So your specific task was managing teams, notifying people, working through email, setting things up, getting everything organized. What action did you take? That's when you can add in that quantifying information. I helped to set up 100 volunteers for a 4-day service project. And then what was the result, right? Talk about, we were successfully able to have 80 of those volunteers show up and serve for 72 hours or whatever it's going to be. And I always say with this result piece, so for example, for maybe let's say like an intern project, maybe you're working with a finance-based team and they ask you to do some sort of specific project that you have to report back on. If your result wasn't positive, maybe you messed something up, maybe you couldn't figure out how to work the systems or things like that, make sure you share the true results, because even if it failed, even if maybe the project didn't go well or whatever it was, it's still important for you to share that, hey, this really did fail and it didn't work well, but here's the things that I learned. Because what that demonstrates to a company is that you are self-reflective and that you are able to kind of learn from your experiences. So the more that you can practice here, the better. So kind of a few thoughts around practicing. On campus, obviously you guys can do mock interviews through the Career Center, and I'm sure other places on campus. But the second thing I would say is getting to practice with family and friends. Like, I know it sounds so silly, but if you can answer an interview question well with a friend, you can crush it in an interview, because our friends are going to make us laugh and we're going to feel a little embarrassed or weird that we're having to answer these questions. And it's going to help you work out those nerves that you have. If you don't have folks around to help you practice, what I would highly recommend is setting up a phone somewhere around your space and recording yourself answering interview questions. And again, I know it sounds weird, but it's such a helpful way for you to figure out what you look like in an interview. Where do your hands go? Where do you look? You know, what is your body language like? Do you slouch in the middle? Are you, do you seem anxious? Is your voice inflection off? And one thing I didn't say is that most interview questions should be answered between 2.5 to 3 minutes. So another part that's really helpful with recording yourself is that you're able to timestamp how long it takes you to interview questions, or answer interview questions, and to figure out if you're answering them well. Sometimes it just feels like you're talking and you can't even remember what you're saying. So recording yourself is a really helpful way to figure out all of that. So the last thing I kind of wanted to say, just to circle back to these type of interviews, is just a few little tidbits. So I talked about the digital interview, but I wanted to show you guys an example. So for us as a company, we do these pre-recorded digital interviews, which are becoming more common for a lot of companies. And it's basically a way to see your body language, how you articulate yourself, and then also just a good way to see from the front end, do you really have the skills that it takes to be successful in this job? So once you get into the platform, a question will come up. So on this one, it says, tell me why you chose your major and what you hope to do in your future career. So the screen that's blacked out, that is where the image of yourself would pop up. So you would actually see yourself on screen while you're answering, but there's not another person that you're interacting with. So it's all pre-recorded. And so you're just getting a question on the screen, and then you get 2.5 to 3 minutes to answer. So I just wanted to make sure y'all saw the format. Anytime you go to do a digital interview, make sure you check your surroundings on your video beforehand. Make sure you check your sound quality, all of that, to make sure that everything's going to be submitted well. And then in terms of digital or video interviews, this is true for if you're doing a live video interview. You want to make sure you have a non-distracting background. And I put this picture to the right of one of our candidates because I thought it was really good. Ensure your mic and camera work properly. I just talked about that. Another thing I would say is make sure you have your phone available just in case. I've had a computer shut down on me in the middle of an interview, and immediately I was able to jump to the Zoom on my phone and continue that conversation. So always have a backup. You never know if technology is going to fail you. And then the last few things, make sure your atmosphere is quiet, and avoid reading or repeating questions out loud. So I've sat in interviews where I've said to someone, like, tell me a little bit about yourself. And when they go to answer, they say, tell me a little bit about yourself. Okay, so my name is, and I know it sounds so silly, but if you have to repeat your question back to yourself to be able to answer it, just do that inside your head. Try not to be the person who has a lot of feedback that's not related to the answers. Dress professionally. I have heard of several recruiter friends who have had a video interview with someone. And again, the past 2.5 years, we've done a ton of them, but they ask the person to stand up and they might have a blazer or a nice top. And then all of a sudden they have like sweatpants on the bottom. And for them, they have them stand up to see, like, are you bringing your full and complete professional self to this interview and ultimately to this job? So make sure you have a full professional top and bottom. And then lastly, just making sure you have your files ready. And I mean your resume, if you had to write a bio or if you had to bring any sort of resources there. So the last little piece, and I know we're about a minute over, so I'll try to go through this part quick, is really just on the follow-up. So a lot of questions I get from students are, when should I send a thank you note? How should I send a thank you note? How many times can I follow up to check the status of my application? So what I would say is it's really good to send a thank you note within 48 hours. You should have everyone's email address. So I would say in the very least send an electronic one. If you happen to get to go to an office to interview, a handwritten note will always make you stand out as a candidate overwhelmingly. I have every handwritten note that I've ever gotten from candidates in my office. And it just, I don't know, it's just because we have so much technology today that a handwritten note just seems more thoughtful. So if you have the opportunity to send that, awesome. And what you typically can do when you're walking out of the office, you can stop at the receptionist desk to say, hey, can you give this note to X, Y, and Z? Now, when you are writing, whether you decide to send an email or a written thank you note, you want to obviously say thank you for your time, but make sure you put in the letter something that was meaningful in the interview. So maybe you both talked about being from Charleston and growing up there. Maybe you talked about a sports team or an activity that you resonated with. Put something that's going to help them remember, oh yeah, that was her. And then lastly, in terms of tracking timelines, I would say do not reach out more than 3 times for an update. And again, you kind of want to stagger those. So maybe if you haven't heard anything back in a week, follow up then from there, like 3 weeks, and then maybe 4. Typically, most companies are filling jobs within 4 to 6 weeks. So the process is a lot more delayed. Now that's going to look different for internships versus full-time jobs, but it is helpful for you to ask on the front end, sort of what does the timeline look like? So that's a good question to ask as well, so you can kind of know when to reach out. And these are just kind of helpful messages. Again, I'll send this out, but knowing how to utilize LinkedIn and writing thank you notes. So these 3 really were good and thorough follow-ups. And then this one, hey, Bri, how you doing? Hope all is going well. Like, I don't know you. We don't have an established relationship. You don't want to talk too casual with people. You want to make sure that you are professional in your communication. Okay, that's everything. If anybody has questions, feel free to go off mute and ask them, or I'll be looking in the chat. Okay, I don't think anyone has any questions. If you all would like, I will put my LinkedIn URL in the chat in case you want to connect. But yes, you guys will have access to this presentation. Thank you so much for listening and joining today, and good luck in the future.
Thanks everybody for joining us today.